11,600 years ago, on a bare limestone hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey, a group of people who had never planted a seed, never herded an animal, never built a permanent house, quarried 16-ton blocks of stone, carved them into towering pillars, dragged them across open ground, and raised them into circles. Then, centuries later, they buried the whole thing. Not let it fall. Not watched it crumble under wind and time. They filled it in, deliberately, with soil and broken tools and the bones of thousands of animals, until every pillar disappeared beneath an artificial hill that would sit untouched for the next 10,000 years. Picture, for a moment, the specific labor this required, before any explanation of why. A crew of people, perhaps several dozen working together, hauling a single quarried block across open, uneven ground using nothing more than rope braided from plant fiber and rollers cut from local timber, in a landscape with no draft animal strong enough to help them and no wheel yet invented to ease the friction. Each pillar weighing as much as a city bus. Each one carved, before or after transport, with the patient, repetitive strikes of a stone tool against stone, a process that experimental archaeologists estimate would have taken weeks of sustained work for even a single relief panel. There is more here for you, if you would like it. If you find a place like this one, quiet, patient, built for the long dark of a winter night, consider subscribing, so the channel can keep finding you when you need it most. And for those who would like a little more, channel members receive early access to every documentary before it appears here, and a quiet way to support the slow work these stories take to make. Tonight, though, we go back to the hill. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and the date alone should stop you. 9,600 years before the Common Era. That is roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge. Roughly 7,000 years before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was set in place. It predates writing by more than 5,000 years, predates the wheel, predates pottery, predates the domestication of wheat in the very valley where the hill stands. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers in the fullest sense of the word, moving with the seasons, tracking gazelle and wild boar across a landscape that had only recently emerged from the last ice age. Everything every textbook used to say about how civilization works, farming first, surplus second, religion and monumental building only after a society could feed itself without working every daylight hour, this hill quietly contradicts. For nearly a century, archaeologists walking this exact ground had no idea what was beneath their feet. A 1963 survey by a joint American and Turkish team noted broken limestone slabs scattered across the hilltop and concluded they were nothing more than an abandoned medieval cemetery, unremarkable, not worth a return visit. The notes went into an archive. The hill went back to being grazing land for local shepherds, who knew it only as Potbelly Hill, a place where stone fragments occasionally surfaced in the soil and were pushed aside without much thought. The hill itself sits on the crown of a limestone ridge, exposed to wind from every direction, with views stretching south across the Harran Plain toward the modern Syrian border, a landscape that, 11,600 years ago, would have looked considerably greener and considerably wilder than the dry agricultural plain that surrounds it now. Wild gazelle moved across these slopes in herds large enough to sustain organized hunting parties. Wild einkorn wheat grew thick on the surrounding hillsides, not yet cultivated by anyone, simply there, ready to be gathered each season by whoever knew where to look and when to come. It was, by the standards of the post-Ice Age world, a rich landscape, capable of supporting exactly the kind of periodic large gathering that the hilltop above it would eventually come to host. It would take another 31 years, and one archaeologist who refused to accept the easy explanation, before anyone understood what was actually sleeping under that grass. And when the digging finally began, what came up out of the ground would not simply rewrite a textbook. It would force an entire field to ask a question it had never seriously had to ask before. What if the order of things was backward? What if the temple came first, and everything else, the farms, the villages, the surplus, came afterward, built by people who were still learning how to feed the workers they had already organized to build something they had no practical need for at all? The man who finally looked at that scattered limestone and refused to walk away was a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, and the story of how he found it again has the particular shape of a thing that was always there, waiting for someone to stop, kneel down, and actually look. In 1994, Schmidt was surveying sites across southeastern Anatolia, cross-referencing decades-old field notes against the landscape itself, the kind of patient, unglamorous work that rarely produces headlines. He came across the 1963 report describing the limestone fragments on the hill above Sanliurfa and the conclusion that they were nothing more than a forgotten cemetery. Something about the description did not sit right with him. The earlier survey team had been looking for the wrong kind of site, expecting graves, expecting a settlement, and had measured what they found against that expectation rather than against what was actually lying in the dirt. Schmidt drove out to the hill himself. Within minutes of arriving, he later said, he understood that the earlier team had missed something enormous. The broken slabs were not gravestones. They were fragments of T-shaped pillars, carved limestone megaliths with the same distinctive flat-topped silhouette he recognized from a single much smaller comparable site discovered years earlier at Navali Kori, a site that had since been flooded by a dam reservoir before it could be fully studied. Here, on this hill, the fragments were everywhere, and they were bigger. He stood on the hilltop that first afternoon, by his own account, and recognized that he was looking at something the earlier 1963 surveyors had genuinely never seen before, not through carelessness but through the simple limitation of expecting one kind of site and finding the surface evidence of a completely different one. A scatter of broken limestone reads as rubble to someone looking for graves. The same scatter reads as the shattered top edge of buried megaliths to someone who already knows, from Navali Kori, exactly what that particular silhouette of broken stone tends to mean. Schmidt had trained as a prehistorian, building his career on careful, unglamorous fieldwork across multiple sites in Germany and Turkey before this particular afternoon redirected the rest of his professional life entirely. Colleagues who knew him before the discovery describe a methodical, somewhat understated researcher, more comfortable with the patient accumulation of stratigraphic detail than with theoretical speculation, a temperament that would prove unusually well suited to the decades of careful, incremental work the hill demanded of him. He began excavating that same year. Within a single season, his team had uncovered the tops of two massive pillars still standing upright in the earth, exactly where they had been raised millennia before. By the time systematic digging was underway, the scale of what lay beneath the hill became impossible to overstate. Circular and oval enclosures, each one ringed by a wall of smaller pillars, with two central pillars standing taller than the rest at the heart of every circle, facing one another like figures mid-conversation. Some of the central pillars reached more than 5 meters in height and weighed as much as 16 tons, quarried from bedrock several hundred meters away and somehow moved, without wheels, without draft animals, without a single piece of metal tooling of any kind, to the precise spot their builders had chosen for them. The quarries themselves still sit visible on the hillside nearby, partially worked pillars left exactly where their carvers abandoned them, one still half attached to the bedrock, as though the workers simply stopped one afternoon and never returned to finish the cut. Tool marks preserved in the stone, the regular repeated impressions of flint and chert-hand tools striking the same limestone surface thousands of times, give archaeologists a direct, physical record of exactly how this carving was done, hour after hour, by hands using nothing more sophisticated than sharpened stone. Schmidt would spend the rest of his life at this site, returning season after season for nearly 2 decades, slowly exposing more of what the hill had been hiding, and slowly building the case for an idea that the rest of his field initially found very difficult to accept. What makes the pillars themselves so unsettling to look at, even now, in photographs taken under careful museum lighting, is not simply their size. It is what is carved into them. Run your eyes down the broad face of any major pillar at Göbekli Tepe, and you find a menagerie rendered in low relief with a level of technical control that should not, by any conventional account of human development, exist yet. Foxes caught mid-stride, their bodies elongated and tense. Boars with bristled spines and bared tusks. Cranes standing in profile, their long necks curved with an almost calligraphic precision. Scorpions, their tails arched and ready. Vultures, wings spread, talons extended, appearing again and again across multiple pillars in a way that suggests they meant something specific and shared, a symbol everyone who gathered here would have immediately understood, even though no one alive today can fully reconstruct what that meaning was. The animals chosen for these carvings are, notably, almost entirely the kind of creatures hunter-gatherers in this region would have feared, respected, or hunted rather than the kind they would have eventually domesticated. There are no carved sheep, no carved cattle, nothing resembling the livestock that would come to dominate the region's economy within a few centuries of the hill's construction. The visual world the builders chose to render in permanent stone was a wild one, populated by predators, scavengers, and dangerous game, the animals that shaped daily survival for people who still depended entirely on hunting and foraging for their food. Some of the pillars carry stylized human arms along their sides, hands meeting at the front the way a figure might clasp them below the waist, complete with carved belts and loincloths rendered in stone. The T-shape of the pillars themselves, many researchers believe, was never meant to represent an abstract architectural form at all. It was meant to represent a body. A head, simplified to its essential silhouette, set atop shoulders. The two tallest central pillars in each enclosure, facing each other across the open space inside the circle, may not be architectural supports in any structural sense. They may be the two most important guests at whatever was happening here, rendered in stone large enough to never leave. The detail on the smaller arm and hand carvings is precise enough to show individual fingers, the proportions and placement consistent enough across multiple pillars and multiple enclosures that the people carving them were clearly working from a shared, agreed visual language rather than improvising a new design for each new stone. Belts carved in low relief sometimes carry their own decorative patterning, small geometric motifs repeating along the waistline, the kind of detail that takes deliberate, unhurried craftsmanship to execute correctly in stone this hard, using tools this simple. Then there is Pillar 43, in the enclosure researchers call D, which carries an image that none of the wildlife carvings elsewhere on the site quite prepare you for. A headless human figure, depicted with unmistakable detail, crouches beneath an enormous carved vulture, one wing extended as though offering something upward toward the sky. Above the scene, a disembodied human head appears to roll free, untethered from any body, drifting near a shape some researchers read as a celestial symbol and others read as something else entirely. No accompanying text explains the scene, because there was no writing yet to leave one. What it depicts, no one currently knows for certain. What is clear is that the people who carved it were not simply decorating a building. They were recording something they considered urgent enough to render in stone, on a pillar that would eventually be deliberately buried along with everything around it, sealed beneath the hill for 10,000 years, waiting for someone to come looking. To understand why Göbekli Tepe unsettled the field of archaeology so completely when Schmidt's findings began circulating, you have to understand the story everyone had agreed on before this hill forced them to reconsider it. The textbook sequence ran like this. First, people learned to farm. Domesticating wheat and barley, then sheep and goats, gave communities a reliable surplus of food for the first time in human history, food that did not need to be hunted or gathered fresh each day. That surplus freed some members of a community from the constant work of finding their next meal. With that freedom came specialization, people who could spend their days making tools or pottery, or eventually, once a population grew dense and organized enough, people who could spend their days building monuments and tending to religious life. Agriculture came first. Surplus came second. Religion, art, and monumental architecture came only once a society could afford them. It was a clean, logical chain, and it fit nearly every other archaeological site known at the time. This sequence was not invented carelessly. It reflected genuine, careful observation of sites across the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, ancient Egypt, where monumental temples and palaces consistently appeared centuries or millennia after the archaeological record showed clear evidence of established farming and settled village life. The model worked as far as anyone could test it, because every site available for testing happened to follow it. Göbekli Tepe was the first major exception anyone had found, and exceptions of this scale tend to force a field to reconsider not just the specific site in question but the underlying logic that made the original model seem so reliable in the first place. Göbekli Tepe sits less than 50 kilometers from the hills where wild einkorn wheat, the direct genetic ancestor of nearly all domesticated wheat grown today, still grows naturally. Genetic studies tracing the origin of cultivated wheat point to this exact region, the Karakadag Hills, as the specific place where humans first began deliberately planting and harvesting it, sometime in the centuries following the hill's construction. The implication sat there for anyone willing to follow it. The temple was built first, by people who had not yet domesticated a single crop. Agriculture followed. The genetic evidence behind this conclusion comes from comparing the DNA of modern domesticated einkorn varieties grown by farmers today against samples of the wild einkorn still growing untended on the Karakadag slopes, a comparison precise enough to identify not just the general region of domestication but a remarkably narrow specific area within it. An area that happens to sit close enough to Göbekli Tepe that the hilltops builders could plausibly have walked to gather wild grain from the very fields that would, within a few centuries, become the cradle of agriculture across the entire region. Klaus Schmidt's own theory, developed over 2 decades of excavation, proposed something that inverted the textbook sequence almost entirely. Communities scattered across the region, he argued, gathered periodically at this hilltop for shared ritual, feasting, and construction. Building the enclosures was not something a settled society did once it had the spare capacity. Building the enclosures was the very thing that pulled scattered hunter-gatherer groups together in the first place, requiring organized labor on a scale that, in turn, demanded a more reliable and concentrated food supply than hunting and foraging alone could easily provide. The need to feed the workers may have been one of the specific pressures that pushed the people of this region toward deliberately cultivating the wild grain already growing on the surrounding hillsides. Religion, in this version of events, did not follow agriculture. Religion may have helped invent it. The physical evidence for exactly what happened at Göbekli Tepe during the centuries it was in active use comes almost entirely from what archaeologists have found discarded in the fill that eventually covered it, and that evidence points toward something closer to a sustained, recurring festival than a quiet place of solemn worship. Excavators have recovered tens of thousands of animal bones from the enclosures, the overwhelming majority of them from wild gazelle, alongside aurochs, wild boar, and various birds, all bearing the cut marks of butchery and the burn marks of cooking. Large stone vessels capable of holding more than 100 liters of liquid have been found at the site, and residue analysis on some fragments has detected the chemical signature of fermentation, oxalate compounds consistent with the brewing of a primitive beer from wild cereal grains. Schmidt's working picture, built from this evidence, described periodic gatherings that drew hunting parties from across a wide surrounding region, arriving with game already killed, slaughtering and roasting it on site, drinking something resembling beer brewed for the occasion, and using the gathering itself as the organizing labor force for raising the next pillar or beginning the next enclosure. The scale of the gazelle bones alone is difficult to picture casually. Tens of thousands of individual animals, butchered and consumed across the centuries of the site's use, represent an enormous, sustained hunting effort, coordinated well enough to feed gatherings large enough to leave this volume of refuse behind, repeated season after season for generations. This was not a handful of people quietly maintaining a shrine. This was, by every measure the bones can offer, a genuinely significant regional event, drawing enough participants and consuming enough food to register clearly in the archaeological record even 10,000 years later. The logistics of organizing a hunt large enough to sustain these gatherings deserve their own consideration. Tracking, encircling, and successfully taking down enough wild gazelle to feed what may have been hundreds of visitors at a time would have demanded its own form of careful coordination, separate from but parallel to the labor of quarrying and raising the pillars themselves. Some researchers have proposed that the hunting itself may have carried its own ceremonial weight, the gathering of meat for the feast functioning as a ritual act in its own right, rather than simply a logistical necessity that happened to precede the construction work. It is, in other words, evidence that looks less like a quiet temple and more like the prehistoric equivalent of a barn raising crossed with a harvest festival, an event significant enough, recurring enough, and important enough to the social fabric of the region that people were willing to do something almost no hunter-gatherer society does without enormous collective motivation: drag multi-ton blocks of stone across open ground using nothing but muscle, rope, and timber rollers, for a purpose that had no practical bearing on whether anyone survived the coming winter. The specific brewing residue identified in the stone vessels has prompted some researchers to suggest the feasting itself functioned as a deliberate incentive structure, a way of recruiting and rewarding labor in a society with no formal currency, no centralized authority capable of compelling work through taxation or decree. Beer, in this reading, was not simply a beverage served alongside the meal. It may have been part of the payment, a tangible, immediate reward offered to hunting parties willing to travel to the hilltop, contribute their labor to raising the next pillar, and stay long enough to see the work through, in a social system that had to motivate cooperation through generosity and shared celebration rather than command. What the carvings, the bones, and the beer residue together suggest is a community organizing itself, gathering itself, feeding itself on a scale large enough to raise monuments, before that same community had any of the agricultural infrastructure that conventional theory once insisted was a prerequisite for exactly this kind of achievement. For roughly 1,500 years, by the radiocarbon evidence currently available, this pattern continued. Enclosures were built, used for a period of time that current dating cannot pin down with total precision, and then, in many cases, deliberately filled in and covered over, with new, smaller structures sometimes raised directly on top of the buried remains of the old ones. The architectural shift visible across this 1,500-year span is itself worth pausing on. The earliest enclosures, the ones dated closest to 9,600 BCE, tend to be the largest and most ambitious, circular structures incorporating the tallest central pillars found anywhere on the site. Later construction, dated centuries afterward, trends progressively smaller and more rectangular, a gradual architectural simplification that some researchers read as a kind of slow institutional decline, the original ambition and resources of the earliest builders gradually thinning across generations, even as the underlying tradition of building, gathering, and eventually burying continued in a reduced form. This trajectory, large and ambitious, giving way over centuries to smaller and more modest, runs counter to the intuitive assumption that monumental traditions only ever grow more elaborate over time as societies accumulate more resources and more skill. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite pattern was at least possible here, an initial burst of extraordinary ambition that the community sustained for a time before settling into a quieter, less monumental version of the same underlying practice, a pattern that, whatever its specific cause, complicates any simple story of steady progress toward ever greater achievement. This is the detail that turns Göbekli Tepe from a remarkable discovery into something closer to a genuine mystery, because the burial itself does not behave the way abandoned ruins normally behave. Sites that are simply left to decay collapse unevenly. Walls fall outward. Roofs cave in over years or decades, leaving debris scattered according to where gravity happened to pull it. What excavators found instead, in enclosure after enclosure, were pillars still standing fully upright, walls still structurally intact, buried beneath fill that reached evenly up to and sometimes above the tops of pillars more than 5 meters tall, with no evidence of the kind of structural collapse that should have preceded a burial of that depth. The soil immediately surrounding several buried pillars shows no sign of the gradual, uneven settling that would be expected from centuries of slow natural accumulation, the kind of settling that leaves visible layering and compaction patterns archaeologists are well trained to recognize. Instead, the fill in many sections appears to have been deposited relatively quickly, in a single sustained episode or a short series of them, rather than the patient, incremental work of wind and rain working across 10,000 years. The fill itself raises its own questions. It is not the kind of wind-blown dust or gradual sediment that accumulates naturally over centuries of slow erosion. It is dense, mixed material, soil combined with broken stone tools, fragments of ground limestone, and an enormous quantity of animal bone, the same kind of refuse left behind by the feasting that the enclosures seem to have hosted. Someone, it appears, deliberately gathered this material, much of it the literal debris of the celebrations that had been held inside these very walls, and used it to fill the enclosures from floor to ceiling, sealing each one as though closing a door that was never meant to open again. Not every archaeologist accepts this reading without reservation. A more recent study led by German Archaeological Institute researcher Moritz Kinzel has pointed to inconsistencies in the burial pattern that a uniform, intentional ritual closure should not produce. The deepest, most complete fill tends to cluster in the sections of each enclosure closest to the surrounding hillside, exactly where natural erosion and slope wash would be expected to deposit material fastest, and this region sits in an area with a documented history of seismic activity capable of dislodging loose hillside soil in sudden, significant volumes. The debate has not resolved cleanly in either direction. What nearly everyone agrees on is the timing. Whatever combination of human hands and shifting earth did the work, the burial happened relatively soon after each enclosure's main period of use, not as the slow accumulation of 10,000 years of neglect, but as something that closed the chapter on this hill's specific story while the story itself was still, in human terms, recent. No one has ever found a house at Göbekli Tepe. Not a hearth ringed with the ordinary domestic debris of daily life, not a refuse pit of the kind that accumulates wherever people actually sleep and eat and raise children over years. Schmidt was emphatic about this absence throughout his excavations, and it became one of the central pillars, so to speak, of his argument that this hill was never a settlement at all. People came here. They worked here, intensively, for periods of time. Then, it seems, they left. The absence is striking precisely because pre-pottery Neolithic settlement sites elsewhere in the region are not subtle about their domestic character. Excavated villages from the same broad period preserve clear hearths, often used continuously across many seasons, post holes marking where roof supports once stood, and the dense scatter of broken tools, food remains, and everyday refuse that accumulates naturally wherever people actually live their daily lives. Göbekli Tepe preserves almost none of this. What it preserves instead is evidence of intensive periodic activity, concentrated feasting, concentrated construction, and then quiet, repeated for centuries, in a pattern that looks far more like a destination than a home. What they may have left behind instead of houses is something considerably stranger. Scattered across the floors of several enclosures, archaeologists have recovered human skulls bearing deliberate, careful modification, deep grooves carved into the back of the cranium in a pattern too regular to be accidental damage. The grooves appear positioned in a way that would have allowed a cord or cord-like material to be threaded through the bone, suspending the skull, displaying it, perhaps hanging it from a fixture the way a portrait might hang on a wall. No complete burials have been found at the site. No graves, No skeletons laid out in the position of formal interment. Only these isolated, modified skull fragments, set apart from the rest of the body they once belonged to. The fragments recovered so far number only a handful, a detail that itself raises questions, since a site used continuously for 15 centuries should, under almost any model of regular ritual practice, have produced far more human remains than archaeologists have actually found. Either the modified skulls represent a small, especially significant subset of a larger funerary tradition whose other remains were deliberately taken elsewhere, or the practice itself was rarer and more selective than the imagery on the pillars might initially suggest, reserved for specific individuals whose presence the community wished to keep close in a way that ordinary members of the group did not require. One widely discussed interpretation connects this to a practice documented at other pre-pottery Neolithic sites across the broader region, a funerary tradition in which the recently dead were not buried in the ground at all but left exposed, often on raised wooden platforms, where carrion birds, the same vultures carved so prominently into the pillars surrounding these very skull fragments, would strip the flesh from the bone over a period of days or weeks. Once the body had been reduced to clean bone through this process, the skeleton might then be moved, the skull singled out for special treatment, carved, suspended, displayed, perhaps as part of an ongoing relationship between a community and its specific, named dead rather than a single act of burial and closure. If this reading holds, the vultures on the pillars are not simply decorative wildlife. They may be participants in the single most significant transition a person in this community would ever undergo, the journey from flesh to bone, witnessed and assisted by the birds the builders chose to carve, again and again, larger than any other animal on the site, wings spread directly above a headless human figure on the one pillar that depicts a person at all. The astronomical claims that have circulated around Göbekli Tepe in recent years deserve to be addressed carefully, because they sit in an unusually contested space between legitimate research and the kind of speculation that tends to attach itself to any site this old, this strange, and this short on written explanation. In 2017, engineering researcher Martin Sweatman published an analysis arguing that the animal carvings on several pillars, particularly the dense cluster of symbols on Pillar 43, function as a deliberate astronomical record, encoding the position of constellations at the moment of a catastrophic comet impact roughly 13,000 years ago, an event some researchers have proposed as a trigger for a sudden global cooling period called the Younger Dryas. Sweatman's interpretation reads the vulture's outstretched wing as marking a specific point in the sky, the other carved animals standing in for specific constellations, the entire pillar functioning as something close to a star chart memorializing a disaster. The argument draws additional support, in Sweatman's reading, from independent dating of the Younger Dryas cooling event itself and from broader patterns of animal symbolism that he and his collaborators argue recur across multiple prehistoric sites in ways consistent with a shared astronomical vocabulary, predating Göbekli Tepe and persisting after it. It is a carefully argued position, published through ordinary peer review, and it has found a genuine, if minority, following within the broader field. The Younger Dryas event itself is real and well documented in the broader climate record, a sudden, sharp return to near-glacial conditions roughly 12,900 years ago that interrupted what had otherwise been a steady post-Ice Age warming trend, lasting more than a millennium before temperatures abruptly recovered again. Whether this climatic disruption was triggered by a cometary impact, as Sweatman and a minority of researchers propose, or by other mechanisms entirely, remains an active and genuinely unsettled question within climate science itself, independent of whatever connection it may or may not have to the carvings at Göbekli Tepe. The response from the broader archaeological community working directly on the site has been skeptical, in some cases sharply so. Critics point out that pairing specific animal carvings with specific constellations requires choices that are not fixed by anything in the carvings themselves, meaning a determined researcher could likely find comparable celestial correspondences in the animal symbolism of dozens of other prehistoric sites. simply because there are enough animals and enough constellations that some coincidental matches are statistically almost guaranteed to appear. The carvings, these archaeologists argue, are better explained as a coherent symbolic and mythological system specific to the people who made them, one we currently lack the cultural context to fully translate, rather than as an encoded scientific record of a single catastrophic event. What both sides of this disagreement actually share, underneath the dispute, is a refusal to reach for the explanation that tends to surface fastest in public conversation about any site this old, that the builders must have had help they could not have managed alone. They did not. Every serious researcher who has worked the soil at Göbekli Tepe describes the same conclusion, arrived at independently and repeated consistently across 2 decades of excavation reports. The people who built this hill were cognitively, biologically, in every meaningful sense, exactly like us, working with stone tools, rope, timber, and an extraordinary, sustained, collective will toward a purpose we are still working to fully understand. What ended the use of Göbekli Tepe was not a single dramatic event that any excavation has uncovered. There is no layer of ash consistent with destruction by fire, no evidence of violent conflict, no sign that the hill was overrun or abandoned in haste. The enclosures simply, gradually, stopped being built, the gatherings that had sustained them apparently growing less frequent, the practice of construction and burial that had defined the site for 15 centuries slowing, and then, sometime around 8000 BCE, stopping altogether. The timing lines up with a broader transformation already underway across the region. By this point, communities nearby had begun cultivating the wild einkorn wheat growing on the surrounding hillsides in earnest, settling into the first true villages the archaeological record shows for this part of the world, places with actual houses, actual hearths, actual evidence of people sleeping and eating and dying in the same location across multiple generations. The kind of life Göbekli Tepe's builders had never lived at the hill itself was beginning to take root just a short walk away. Whatever social and ritual need had once required gathering scattered hunting groups at a single hilltop for collective construction and feasting may simply have been replaced by a different way of organizing a community, one rooted in fixed homes and cultivated fields rather than periodic pilgrimage. Settlements from this transitional period, excavated at sites scattered across the same general region, show the gradual emergence of exactly the domestic infrastructure Göbekli Tepe itself so conspicuously lacks. Storage pits for grain. Hearths used repeatedly across multiple seasons. The bones of the first domesticated sheep and goats, animals whose skeletal proportions begin shifting, generation by generation, away from their wild ancestors in ways that mark the slow, observable process of selective breeding taking hold. The world the hilltops builders had organized themselves around, periodic gathering, shared feasting, collective construction at a single significant site, was giving way to a world organized instead around the household, the field, and the flock. This shift did not happen overnight, and it likely did not feel, to the people living through it, like the dramatic civilizational turning point that modern textbooks describe in hindsight. It would have felt instead like 1,000 small, ordinary decisions, accumulated across generations, each one reasonable in its own moment, that together added up to an entirely different way of organizing daily life. A family choosing to stay near a particularly reliable patch of wild grain one extra season. A community deciding the walk to the hilltop gathering had grown too long, too costly, in a year when the local harvest demanded more constant attention. None of these individual choices would have felt like the end of anything in particular. Looking back across 11,000 years, they look like the beginning of everything that followed. It is worth remembering that the people living through this transition had no way of knowing they were living through anything historians would one day study at all. They were simply making the same kinds of practical, immediate decisions every human community has always made, weighing the cost of travel against the benefit of staying close to home, weighing the labor of construction against the labor of tending a planted field, generation after generation, until the accumulated weight of those ordinary choices had quietly produced an entirely new way of living that no single person had ever deliberately chosen or designed. The hill went quiet. Whether the final act of covering the last enclosures was a deliberate closing ceremony, performed by people who understood they were ending something, or the slower accumulation of erosion finishing what earlier deliberate burials had already begun, the hilltop disappeared beneath an unremarkable grass-covered mound, indistinguishable, to anyone who did not already know what was underneath, from any other hill in southeastern Anatolia. For the next 10,000 years, shepherds grazed their flocks across the surface without knowing what their animals were walking on top of. Wheat grew in the valley below, the same crop the hill may have helped bring into existence. Empires rose and fell within sight of the hilltop, Akkadian, Assyrian, Roman, Ottoman, each one leaving its own layer of history on the landscape, none of them aware of the older layer sleeping directly beneath their feet, sealed by hands that had no name anyone alive could still remember. What has been excavated and documented since Schmidt's first season in 1994 represents, by the most widely cited estimate among the archaeologists currently working the site, somewhere around 5% of the total mound. Geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have identified the outlines of additional buried enclosures across the rest of the hill, perhaps 20 in total, most of them still completely untouched by a single excavator's trowel. These geophysical scans work by detecting subtle variations in soil density and magnetic properties without requiring a single shovel of earth to be moved, effectively letting researchers sketch the outline of what lies beneath the surface before deciding whether and how to excavate it. The technique has revealed an underground landscape considerably larger and more complex than the visible excavated portion suggests, enclosure after enclosure registering as distinct circular anomalies in the survey data, patiently waiting in the exact configuration their builders left them in, undisturbed by anything except the slow, indifferent pressure of 10,000 years of accumulated soil. The decision to leave the remaining 95% in the ground was not made out of a lack of curiosity. It reflects a hard lesson the field of archaeology has learned, often painfully, from earlier excavations conducted before conservation science had caught up with the ambition of the dig itself. Stone exposed to open air after 10,000 years buried in stable, moisture-regulated soil begins to weather rapidly, the carved surfaces that survived intact for millennia starting to flake and degrade within years of being uncovered if the right protective infrastructure is not already in place before the first shovel goes into the ground. Schmidt's successors have chosen patience over speed, exposing only what current conservation technology, current funding, and current understanding can properly protect, leaving the rest sealed exactly the way its original builders apparently intended it to remain. The steel canopy now covering the excavated portion of the site represents exactly this kind of hard-won caution, a multi-million-dollar structure built specifically to regulate temperature and humidity above the exposed enclosures, slowing the weathering process that direct sun and rain would otherwise accelerate. Walkways suspended above the dig allow visitors to look down into the enclosures without their footsteps compacting or disturbing the excavated surfaces below, a compromise between public access and physical preservation that took years of planning to get right. It means that the version of Göbekli Tepe currently open to researchers and visitors, the version that has already overturned a century of assumptions about the origins of religion, architecture, and organized labor, is by the excavator's own account only a small fraction of what the hill actually contains. Whatever waits in the unexcavated 95%, sealed enclosures that may be older still, carvings no living person has seen since the people who made them covered them over, remains, for now, exactly where it has been for 10,000 years. Underground. Undisturbed. Waiting. There is a particular discipline required to stand at the edge of a known mystery and choose not to dig further, simply because the tools to do it responsibly are not yet fully in hand. Future excavation seasons, future generations of researchers, future advances in conservation technology not yet developed, will eventually decide how much more of the hill gets uncovered and on what timeline. For now, the decision has been made, deliberately, to let most of Göbekli Tepe remain exactly as its builders left it, sealed against the open air, protected by the same patient burial that preserved it for the 10,000 years before anyone thought to look. The hill is not alone. In the years since Schmidt's discovery became internationally known, archaeologists surveying the wider region around Sanliurfa have identified what now appears to be a constellation of related sites, each one sharing the same basic architectural vocabulary: T-shaped pillars, circular enclosures, carved animal reliefs, scattered across a roughly 200-kilometer radius of southeastern Anatolia. Karahan Tepe, roughly 60 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, has produced findings since systematic excavation began there in 2019 that rival and in some specific respects exceed what Göbekli Tepe itself has yielded. A chamber discovered at Karahan Tepe contains 11 pillars carved directly from the surrounding bedrock rather than quarried and transported, along with a striking central sculpture, a human head emerging from solid rock, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, positioned to face a carved phallic pillar across the chamber in a juxtaposition whose meaning, like so much at these sites, remains a subject of careful, ongoing debate rather than settled conclusion. Other sites within the same network, with names like Sefer Tepe, Hamzin Tepe, and Sayberk, have produced their own distinctive carvings, including, at Sayberk, a remarkable scene showing two leopards flanking a human figure who appears to be holding what some researchers interpret as part of an animal's reproductive anatomy, a narrative composition unlike anything found at Göbekli Tepe itself, suggesting that each site within this broader network developed its own local variations on a shared, underlying tradition rather than simply repeating an identical template across the region. The Turkish government's Taz Tepeler project, launched specifically to coordinate excavation and research across this entire network of related sites, represents one of the largest organized archaeological initiatives currently underway anywhere in the world, bringing together teams from multiple countries and universities under a shared research framework rather than allowing each site to be studied in isolation. The project's stated ambition is nothing less than reconstructing, site by site, the social and ritual world that existed across this corner of Anatolia in the centuries immediately before agriculture transformed it permanently. Each newly identified site adds its own piece to a picture that grows simultaneously clearer and more complicated with every excavation season. Some sites within the network show clear architectural similarities to Göbekli Tepe, suggesting direct cultural connection or shared origin. Others diverge in ways that hint at distinct local traditions developing their own variations on a shared underlying impulse, distinct communities reaching toward the same basic idea: monumental gathering, monumental carving, monumental construction without agriculture, by routes that were not necessarily identical. What this growing network of sites suggests is that Göbekli Tepe was never an isolated anomaly, a single hilltop where one unusually motivated community happened to build something extraordinary and then stopped. It appears instead to be one node, possibly an especially large and significant one, within a broader cultural and ritual landscape that spanned a substantial portion of the Fertile Crescent during precisely the centuries when agriculture itself was first taking root nearby. The region archaeologists are now calling the Taz Tepeler, the Stone Hills, may eventually reveal that the transition from hunting and gathering to farming was not a single quiet innovation that happened in one place and spread. It may have been accompanied, possibly even driven, by a shared ritual tradition playing out across dozens of hilltops simultaneously, each community building its own version of the same fundamental idea, for reasons the carved stones can gesture toward but cannot, on their own, fully explain. Klaus Schmidt did not live to see how far this picture would eventually expand. He died in 2014, at 60 years old, while in Germany for a routine medical procedure, 20 years almost to the season after he first drove out to a hill above Sanliurfa and recognized, within minutes, that an earlier survey team had walked past something extraordinary without seeing it. He spent those 20 years returning to the site nearly every excavation season, building, piece by piece, an argument that the field of archaeology did not initially want to accept, that monumental architecture, organized religion, and the kind of disciplined collective labor that raising a 16-ton pillar requires could exist among people who had not yet planted a single crop. He described the hill, in interviews given late in his career, as the place where humans first built a house for their gods before they had finished building houses for themselves. It is a tidy phrase, the kind that gets quoted often, and like most tidy phrases about a site this old, it compresses a far stranger and more open question than it answers. Colleagues who worked alongside Schmidt describe a man who treated the slow, repetitive labor of careful excavation with something close to reverence, returning to the same pillar across multiple seasons to clear it a centimeter at a time, photographing every stage, resisting the pressure that media attention increasingly placed on the dig to produce dramatic new finds on a faster timeline than the conservation work could safely support. His insistence on patience, even as the site's growing fame brought television crews and international journalists to the hilltop in numbers no one had anticipated when the first season began, shaped the methodical, protective excavation culture that his successors have continued in the years since. He gave countless interviews over the years, by every account growing visibly more animated when discussing the hilltop's implications for understanding the broader sweep of human history than when discussing himself or his own career, treating the site less as a personal achievement and more as a genuine collaborative conversation between his excavation team and a community of builders separated from them by 11,600 years. Visitors and colleagues alike recall him walking the site with a particular unhurried attentiveness, often pausing at carvings he had seen hundreds of times before, as though still, after 2 decades, finding something new in them each season. The team Schmidt trained has continued the work in the years since his death, joined now by a growing international roster of researchers drawn to the wider Taz Tepeler network his discovery helped reveal. The German Archaeological Institute maintains an active excavation presence at the site, alongside Turkish researchers from the Sanliurfa Museum, which now displays many of the most significant finds, including several of the modified skulls and a small but striking collection of carved figures, within sight of the hill itself. The museum itself, built specifically to house the growing collection of finds from Göbekli Tepe and the wider Taz Tepeler sites, has become something of a pilgrimage site in its own right, drawing visitors who come first to the climate-controlled galleries to see the most fragile and significant carvings up close, under glass, before making the short drive out to the hilltop itself to stand among the larger pillars too massive to ever be moved indoors. Among the most striking objects on display is a life-size human statue, discovered nearby and dated to roughly the same period, its eyes inlaid with dark stone, its hands clasped at its chest in a posture echoing the same gesture carved into so many of the T-shaped pillars on the hill above. What none of them have answered, after 3 decades of careful, patient excavation, is the question that drew Schmidt back to this hilltop season after season for the better part of his career. Not how the pillars were built, that part, difficult as it must have been, is reasonably well understood through experimental archaeology and the physical evidence of tool marks left in the quarried stone. The unanswered question is the older one, the one the vultures and the headless figure and the deliberately buried fill all seem to be circling without quite landing on. What, exactly, were they for? Standing on the hilltop today, beneath the protective steel canopy that now shelters the excavated enclosures from weather and sun, the first impression is not scale, though the pillars are large enough to dwarf anyone standing beside them. The first impression is silence and the specific quality of the light. Southeastern Anatolia in summer carries a heat that settles into the limestone by midday and radiates back out of it long after the sun has dropped toward the Taurus foothills to the north. Early morning, before the heat arrives in earnest, is when the carvings show themselves most clearly, low raking light catching the edges of each relief and throwing shadows that make a fox or a scorpion or a crane suddenly readable in a way the flat overhead sun of midday tends to erase. Dust moves across the open excavation pits on even the gentlest breeze, fine pale limestone dust that has been settling into the cracks and crevices of these carvings for 10,000 years, and that visitors today can watch doing exactly the same slow, patient work it has always done, one grain at a time. Local guides who lead visitors across the wooden walkways often pause at the same handful of vantage points, the place where the central pillars of Enclosure D come into full view, the spot where Pillar 43 catches enough light to make its carvings legible without the aid of a flashlight. Conversations among visitors tend to drop, unprompted, into something close to a hush the closer the group gets to the central enclosures, the kind of quiet that settles over people standing somewhere they did not entirely expect to feel moved. Winter on this hilltop brings a very different mood entirely, the wind arriving colder and harder off the surrounding plain, the steel canopy occasionally drumming with rain that the limestone beneath it absorbs the way it has absorbed every season for 11,600 years. Visitor numbers thin considerably in these months, and the site, by every account from those who have stood there in this quieter season, takes on a starker, more solitary character, the pillars rising out of the half-empty enclosures with nothing to soften the specific weight of standing in a place this old, this deliberately built, and this deliberately, eventually, buried. Sanliurfa itself, the modern city closest to the site and the place most visitors stay before making the short drive out to the hilltop, carries its own layered history, claimed in local tradition as the birthplace of the biblical Abraham, its old quarters still organized around a sacred pool said to mark the spot where Abraham was thrown into a fire that miraculously transformed into water. The juxtaposition is not lost on visitors who spend a morning at one of the world's oldest sacred sites and an afternoon at a pilgrimage destination tied to one of the world's most enduring religious traditions, two very different kinds of ancient belief sharing the same small patch of southeastern Turkish landscape, separated by more than 10,000 years and yet somehow, in the specific geography of this region, never very far apart. The enclosures themselves sit lower than the modern walkways built around them, so that a visitor looks down into each circle the way one might look down into an excavated grave, the central twin pillars rising up to meet eye level even from several meters above. There is a specific kind of vertigo in this vantage point, knowing that the floor of each enclosure represents a surface that real feet once stood on, real hands once touched, 11,600 years before your own visit, and that the layer of fill removed to expose it again took archaeologists years of careful, deliberate work to clear away, grain by grain, in the opposite direction from however it was originally put there. The wind on this hilltop rarely stops entirely. It moves across the open plain to the south, the same plain where wild einkorn once grew thick enough across the surrounding hillsides to eventually become the foundation of agriculture across the entire region, and it carries, even now, the faint sound of sheep bells from flocks still grazing the slopes below, the same slopes where shepherds once walked for 10,000 years directly above a temple they never knew was there. What Göbekli Tepe forces anyone who studies it seriously to reconsider is not simply a date or a sequence of historical events. It forces a reconsideration of what hunter-gatherer life actually was, a category of human existence that, for most of the 20th century, popular and even much academic imagination treated as a kind of permanent, struggling prehistory, people scraping by from one meal to the next, with neither the time nor the surplus nor the social complexity to build anything more ambitious than a temporary camp. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, by every meaningful measure, hunter-gatherers. They had no fixed settlements at the site itself. They had not domesticated the wheat growing in the valley below them. And yet they organized labor on a scale that required moving stones weighing as much as a city bus, across distances of several hundred meters, using nothing but rope, timber, and the coordinated effort of dozens of people working in concert, repeated across multiple enclosures, sustained across roughly 15 centuries of continuous practice. They developed and maintained a consistent, recognizable artistic and symbolic vocabulary, the same animals, the same T-shaped human silhouette, the same gestures, across generations, across a network of related sites spread over a substantial portion of southeastern Anatolia. They organized, fed, and apparently celebrated with large gatherings of people from multiple, presumably otherwise independent, hunting bands, on a recurring basis significant enough to leave tens of thousands of butchered animal bones behind as evidence. The specific engineering challenge alone deserves more credit than it usually receives. Moving a 16-ton block of limestone several hundred meters across open, uneven terrain, without wheels, without draft animals strong enough for the task, without iron tools to ease the cutting, requires not just brute strength but careful planning, coordinated timing, and almost certainly some form of organized leadership capable of directing dozens of people toward a single shared physical task across multiple days. Experimental archaeology, researchers actually attempting to move comparable stones using only period-appropriate tools and techniques, suggests crews of at least several dozen people, working with sledges, rollers, and ropes woven from plant fiber, would have been required for even the smaller pillars, with the largest examples demanding considerably more. One such experiment, conducted by researchers attempting to replicate the construction techniques available to Göbekli Tepe builders, found that a coordinated team using wooden sledges and rope alone could move a multi-ton stone block roughly 100 meters across level ground in a single day of sustained effort, a pace that, scaled up to the actual distances and elevation changes between the hilltop's quarries and its enclosures, implies weeks rather than days of dedicated labor for each major pillar, repeated across dozens of pillars and multiple enclosures, sustained over centuries. What this scale of labor implies about the social organization of the people undertaking it is, in its own way, as significant as the pillars themselves. Coordinating dozens of people toward a shared, sustained, physically demanding task, repeated across multiple seasons, requires some functional system of leadership, communication, and division of labor, even in the absence of any formal hierarchy that left written or architectural evidence of its existence. The hill is, in this sense, indirect evidence not just of belief and ritual but of genuine social complexity, organizational capacity that the older model of simple, unstructured hunter-gatherer bands had never accounted for. None of this fits comfortably inside the older model of hunter-gatherer life as a thin, struggling existence with no room for anything beyond immediate survival. What it suggests instead is a version of prehistoric life considerably richer in social organization, shared belief, and collective ambition than the conventional sequence of farming first, civilization second, ever allowed for. The hill does not simply push a few dates earlier on a timeline. It quietly dismantles the timeline's underlying logic, the assumption that monumental belief and monumental architecture are luxuries a society can only afford once it has already solved the more basic problem of feeding itself. The question of why, ultimately, remains the one piece of this story that no amount of further excavation may ever fully answer, and it is worth sitting with the specific shape of that uncertainty rather than reaching past it for a tidier conclusion than the evidence actually supports. It is possible the enclosures were built to honor specific ancestors, the modified skulls representing named individuals whose presence the builders wished to keep close, displayed and addressed across generations, the carved animals serving as protective or symbolic companions to the dead. It is possible they marked something closer to a covenant between scattered hunting communities, a recurring gathering point whose construction and maintenance bound otherwise independent groups into something resembling a shared identity, the labor itself functioning as the social glue rather than the architecture being the point. It is possible the carvings encode astronomical or seasonal knowledge that helped these communities track the timing of migrations, of harvests, of the specific window each year when the wild wheat in the surrounding hills was ready to gather, knowledge important enough to render in permanent stone rather than trust to memory alone. None of these explanations cancel each other out. A single site, used continuously for 15 centuries by communities who left no writing to explain themselves, almost certainly carried more than one layer of meaning across that span of time. The purpose of the earliest enclosures potentially drifting, evolving, or accumulating new significance as the generations who built them gave way to grandchildren and great-grandchildren who inherited a tradition rather than its original explanation. There is something worth sitting with in that uncertainty itself, rather than rushing past it toward whichever theory happens to feel most satisfying. 15 centuries is a span of time considerably longer than the entire history of certain modern nations, longer than the gap separating the present day from the height of the Roman Empire. A belief system, a set of rituals, a shared symbolic language maintained that consistently for that long, by people working entirely from memory and oral tradition, with no written record to anchor it, represents its own kind of achievement, independent of whatever the specific content of that belief turns out to have been. Consider what 15 centuries of unbroken oral transmission would actually require. Every generation passing the specific meaning of each carved animal, each ritual gesture, each reason for gathering, to children who had never met the grandparents who first established the practice, with nothing but memory and repetition to guard against drift, distortion, or simple forgetting. That the basic architectural vocabulary, the T-shaped pillars, the central-facing pair, the consistent menagerie of carved animals, remained recognizable across this entire span suggests a transmission system considerably more robust than casual storytelling, something closer to formal, deliberate instruction passed between specific, designated keepers of the tradition from one generation to the next. Modern oral history research, conducted among contemporary cultures that still maintain long unwritten traditions, offers a useful, if imperfect, point of comparison. Studies of song cycles and ritual knowledge passed down across many generations in some indigenous communities have documented details preserved with remarkable fidelity across centuries, suggesting that human memory, properly structured and repeatedly reinforced through ceremony, can sustain considerably more accurate transmission across long stretches of time than casual modern assumption tends to credit it with. What the deliberate burial suggests, more than any specific theory of the hill's purpose, is that whatever it meant to the people who built it, it meant something specific enough and complete enough that they chose to close it rather than abandon it. There is a difference, even now, between a building left to fall and a building someone chooses to seal. The first is simply forgetting. The second is closer to an ending, deliberately marked, by people who understood exactly what they were finishing. The skull cult, as researchers have come to call the broader pattern of skull modification and display documented across multiple pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the wider region, was not unique to Göbekli Tepe. Similar treatment of human skulls, removed from the rest of the skeleton, sometimes plastered and reshaped to recreate the appearance of a living face, sometimes carved with decorative patterns, appears at sites stretching from the Levant through Anatolia during roughly the same broad period, suggesting a shared, widespread set of beliefs about death, ancestry, and the specific power of the human head separated from the body. At Jericho, hundreds of kilometers to the south, excavators uncovered skulls plastered with such careful attention to facial detail, eyes inset with shell, expressions rendered with something close to portraiture, that the practice clearly involved skilled, dedicated specialists rather than casual or improvised treatment. The Göbekli Tepe skull fragments lack this plastering, but the deliberate, careful modification of the bone itself, the precise grooves cut for suspension, points toward a related, if locally distinct, approach to the same underlying concern, that the dead, or at least certain significant individuals among the dead, remained present, displayed, and addressed by the living long after the rest of the body had been dealt with through whatever funerary process the community practiced. The geographic spread of this broader pattern, from sites in the southern Levant through central and eastern Anatolia, suggests something more than isolated local custom. It points toward a shared conceptual framework about death and ancestry that circulated across an enormous region during the pre-pottery Neolithic, carried not through any centralized authority or written doctrine but through the same kind of informal cultural transmission, trade contact, intermarriage, seasonal gathering, that would have connected scattered communities across this part of the ancient Near East long before any of them had a name for themselves that history would record. What distinguishes the skull fragments found at Göbekli Tepe is the context surrounding them. The carved vultures positioned so consistently above human and human-like figures across multiple pillars, the single explicit image on Pillar 43 of a headless body beneath a vulture with one wing extended, as though caught in the act of either delivering or carrying away the very thing the rest of the site's skull fragments suggest was treated with such careful, repeated attention. Some researchers have proposed that this pattern points toward a specific cosmology in which the vulture functioned as a kind of psychopomp, an intermediary guiding the transition between life and whatever the builders of this hill understood to come after it, the bird's role in stripping flesh from bone during exposure burial doubling as a literal and symbolic passage from one state of being to another. Under this reading, the central twin pillars facing each other in every enclosure may represent not gods in any conventional later sense, but ancestors significant enough that an entire community would gather, periodically, across 15 centuries, to build them a house of stone and keep their presence close. It remains, like nearly everything specific about Göbekli Tepe's purpose, an informed interpretation rather than a settled fact. But it is an interpretation built from a pattern that repeats too consistently, across too many pillars and too many seasons of careful excavation, to dismiss as coincidence. Something about death, about the boundary between the living and whatever the builders believed waited on the other side of it, sat at the center of why this hill existed at all. It is a quiet, unsettling thought to sit with on a night like this. 11,600 years before anyone wrote a single word about gods or ghosts or the soul, a community of hunter-gatherers had already developed a sufficiently rich understanding of mortality, sufficiently specific beliefs about what happened to a person after death, that they were willing to organize their entire ritual life, their entire monumental building tradition, around marking and managing that exact transition. Whatever they called it, whatever words they used that no language alive today can recover, they had already arrived at one of the oldest and most universal of human questions, and they had already begun building an answer to it in stone. That question has not gone anywhere in the 11,600 years since. It simply changed its vocabulary, its architecture, its accompanying rituals, while the underlying human need to answer it, somehow, in some durable form, has remained remarkably constant across every civilization that has risen and fallen in between. The broader implication of Göbekli Tepe for how historians and anthropologists understand the origin of religion itself has taken years to fully settle into the field, and it is still, in many respects, settling. For most of the modern academic study of religion, the working assumption treated organized belief systems, gods, priesthoods, sacred architecture, as a relatively late development, arising only after societies had already solved the more basic problems of food, shelter, and social organization through agriculture and settlement. Religion, in this older framework, was something civilizations built once they had the resources to spare for it, a kind of cultural luxury that followed economic security rather than preceding it. This framework had genuine intellectual roots, drawn from 19th and 20th century anthropology, from comparative studies of agricultural societies around the world, from the simple, intuitive logic that building a temple requires time and labor that a population still fully occupied with finding its next meal could not easily spare. It was not an unreasonable position. It was simply built on the evidence available before 1994, evidence that, as it turned out, was missing exactly the kind of site that would have challenged it directly. Scholars working in the decades immediately before Schmidt's discovery had occasionally speculated, in passing, about whether ritual behavior might predate full agricultural settlement somewhere in the archaeological record, but the speculation remained largely theoretical, unsupported by any single site substantial enough to anchor the argument. Göbekli Tepe changed this from a hypothetical possibility into an excavated, dated, physically undeniable fact, and the broader field has spent the years since absorbing exactly how much of its previous framework needed revision as a result. University courses on the origins of religion and the foundations of human civilization, taught for decades using the older sequence as their organizing principle, have had to incorporate this hilltop into their curricula in real time, in a way that few archaeological discoveries of any era have managed to force so directly and so quickly. Students studying the subject today encounter Göbekli Tepe not as a footnote or a curious exception, but as a central, unavoidable piece of evidence that any serious account of how human societies first organized themselves around shared belief now has to explain. Göbekli Tepe inverts that sequence so completely that several major textbooks on the origins of religion and civilization, written and published before 1994, are now, on this specific point, simply incorrect. The site demonstrates that organized, sustained religious or ritual practice, complete with monumental architecture, a consistent symbolic vocabulary, and the capacity to mobilize large-scale collective labor, existed among people who had not yet domesticated a single plant or animal, who had no permanent settlements, no surplus storage. None of the economic infrastructure the older model insisted was a prerequisite. What this suggests, to researchers willing to follow the implication all the way through, is that the human impulse toward shared belief, toward gathering, toward marking significant places and significant transitions with permanent, deliberate construction, may be considerably older and considerably more fundamental to how human societies organize themselves than agriculture, surplus, or settled village life. The temple may not be something civilization eventually produces once it has enough food to spare for the project. The temple may be one of the things that helped produce civilization in the first place, the gathering it required, the cooperation it demanded, the shared meaning it generated among people who otherwise had no particular reason to set aside their independence and work, together, toward something none of them needed in order to simply survive the winter. Tonight, the pillars at Göbekli Tepe stand exactly where they have stood since long before the pyramids, long before Stonehenge, long before anyone on Earth had learned to write down a single word. The vultures still spread their carved wings above figures whose meaning no living language can fully translate. The fox still runs along the stone, frozen mid-stride for 11,600 years. The headless figure beneath Pillar 43 still crouches under its bird, waiting for an explanation that may never fully arrive, no matter how much further excavation eventually uncovers of the 95% still sealed beneath the hill. Somewhere beneath the grass that still covers most of this hilltop, more pillars wait in exactly the darkness their builders left them in, carved with images no living eye has seen in 10,000 years, holding whatever further pieces of this story the patient work of the coming decades will eventually bring back into the light. What the people who built this place actually believed, who they thought was listening when they gathered here, what passed between the living and whatever they understood the dead to have become, none of it survives in any form that can be read the way a Roman inscription can still, today, be translated word for word. What survives instead is the stone itself, and the specific, deliberate choices carved into it, choices that took real time, real coordination, and real conviction to carry out, repeated across 15 centuries by people who never once wrote down why. That silence is, in its own way, the most honest thing about this story. Not every ancient mystery resolves into a tidy answer by the end of a documentary, and Göbekli Tepe has earned the right, after 11,600 years, to keep at least some of what it knows to itself a while longer. Consider, for a moment, what it actually required of them. Someone had to first imagine the shape of a pillar that did not yet exist anywhere in the world. Someone had to organize the quarrying, the carving, the slow, patient transport across open ground using nothing but rope and timber and the strength of dozens of cooperating hands. Someone had to decide, generation after generation, that the gathering was worth repeating, the feast worth holding again, the next enclosure worth beginning. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened because anyone forced it to. It happened because enough people, across enough seasons, across enough centuries, agreed that it mattered. There is no record of a king at Göbekli Tepe, no evidence of a centralized authority capable of commanding labor through force or decree, no palace, no throne, nothing that resembles the kind of top-down power structure that later monumental societies would rely on to build their own great works. Whatever motivated dozens of people to quarry, carve, and haul stone for weeks at a time, season after season, century after century, appears to have come from somewhere else entirely. A shared conviction, a shared obligation, a shared sense that this particular hilltop, and whatever happened there, deserved exactly this kind of sustained, voluntary devotion. It is the absence of compulsion that makes the achievement, if anything, harder to fully explain. A king can order a pyramid built and threaten consequences for those who refuse. A community of scattered hunting bands, with no shared ruler, no standing army, no formal mechanism of enforcement beyond whatever social pressure and shared belief could provide, somehow sustained an identical level of organized, demanding, voluntary labor for 15 centuries. Whatever held that cooperation together, season after season, generation after generation, may be the single most genuinely remarkable thing this hilltop has to teach anyone willing to sit with the question rather than reach immediately for an easier answer. They built something they did not strictly need. They fed each other well enough, gathered often enough, organized labor on a scale large enough to raise stone circles taller than a person, decades before any of them had planted a single field of wheat. Then, when whatever this place had meant to them had run its course, they did not simply let it fall. They filled it in with their own hands, with the bones of their own feasts, and walked away, leaving behind a hill that looked, to absolutely everyone who passed it for the next 10,000 years, like nothing more than ordinary ground. What the burial protected, more than anything else, was the chance for someone, eventually, to find it whole. Imagine the specific, deliberate sequence of choices the closing of even one enclosure would have demanded. Gathering enough fill material, soil and broken tools and the bones of countless feasts to bury structures large enough to house pillars 5 meters tall. Carrying or hauling that material in, basket by basket, load by load, across however many days or weeks the task required. Knowing, the entire time, that the work would erase from daily view something the community had spent generations building and gathering around. It was not a small undertaking, and it was not an accidental one. The fame that found Göbekli Tepe in the years following Schmidt's discovery brought with it a particular kind of attention that the site's actual archaeologists have spent considerable energy responding to, sometimes patiently and sometimes with visible frustration. The persistent public appetite for explanations involving lost advanced civilizations, ancient astronauts, or technology beyond what the historical record can otherwise support. Television documentaries and online content built around the premise that Göbekli Tepe is simply too sophisticated to have been built by ordinary pre-pottery Neolithic hunter-gatherers have proliferated in the years since the site became internationally known, often pointing to the precision of the carving, the scale of the pillars, and the early date itself as evidence that something is missing from the conventional account. Evidence of a forgotten advanced civilization, evidence of contact from beyond, evidence of some capability the historical record has otherwise erased. The actual excavators of the site have addressed these claims directly and consistently, and their response rests on the specific, physical evidence the dig itself has produced. Stone tools recovered in their thousands from the excavation layers show exactly the kind of wear pattern, exactly the kind of technological signature, consistent with flint and chert hand tools and nothing more advanced. The quarries on the hillside nearby preserve the marks of this same simple toolkit, the repetitive percussion scars of stone striking stone, visible in the unfinished pillars still half attached to the bedrock. No metal residue. No tool marks inconsistent with Stone Age technology. No evidence, anywhere in 3 decades of careful excavation, of anything beyond what a sufficiently organized, sufficiently motivated group of Neolithic hunter-gatherers could plausibly achieve with patience, cooperation, and a great deal of time. Researchers who have spent careers on this kind of evidence point out, with a certain weary consistency, that the appeal of the lost civilization explanation rarely survives close contact with the actual material record. Every claim of impossibly precise stone cutting, on closer inspection, turns out to fall within the documented range of what skilled stone tool users elsewhere in the prehistoric world achieved, given enough time and enough patience. Every claim of impossible transport distance, on closer inspection, turns out to involve quarries considerably closer to the finished pillars than popular retellings tend to suggest. The genuinely remarkable achievement, the archaeologists argue, does not require inventing a missing chapter of human history. It requires only taking seriously what people, working together over very long periods of time, with very simple tools, have always been capable of. This pattern, the temptation to look at an unusually impressive achievement from the deep past and assume it must require an explanation beyond ordinary human capability, recurs across the history of archaeology far beyond this one hilltop, attaching itself over the decades to the pyramids, to Stonehenge, to the great earthworks of pre-Columbian South America, almost always eventually giving way, under careful excavation and patient analysis, to the considerably more interesting truth that human beings, organized, motivated, and given enough time, have repeatedly proven capable of more than casual assumption tends to credit them with. What the insistence on outside intervention tends to miss, the archaeologists working the site consistently argue, is that the genuinely remarkable thing about Göbekli Tepe is not that it required advanced technology to build. It is that it did not. It required nothing but human beings, working together, motivated by something they believed in strongly enough to spend 15 centuries building and rebuilding it, using tools no more sophisticated than sharpened stone. That is not a smaller story than the one involving lost civilizations or ancient visitors. In the specific, careful judgment of the people who have spent their careers excavating this hill, it is a considerably larger one. What remains, after everything the excavation has revealed and everything it has not, is a hill in southeastern Turkey that quietly insists on being taken seriously on its own terms, rather than explained away in either direction, neither reduced to a simple curiosity nor inflated into evidence of something the physical record does not actually support. For now, the part of the hill still asleep under the grass keeps its own counsel, exactly as it has for 10,000 years, untroubled by the questions any of us bring to the edge of it. The people who built it left no name for themselves that anyone today can read. They left no account of what they believed, no record of the words spoken during whatever ceremonies brought hunting parties together at this hilltop across 15 centuries. What they left instead was stone, carved with an unmistakable, unhurried care, arranged according to a plan that repeated itself across multiple enclosures with enough consistency to prove it was not improvised, and then, when the time came, deliberately covered over, hidden from the very descendants who might otherwise have inherited it. There is a kind of humility in sitting with a mystery this old and admitting, honestly, how much of it remains genuinely unresolved. Not every question a site this significant raises gets answered simply because enough seasons of careful digging have passed, or because enough scholars have published enough papers proposing enough theories. Some questions, asked of evidence this old and this incomplete, may simply remain open, not because no one has tried hard enough to close them, but because the people who could answer them definitively have been gone for 11,600 years, and the only voice left to speak for them is the stone itself, patient, weathered, and only willing to say so much. It is worth remembering, too, that the people who built Göbekli Tepe almost certainly never imagined anyone would be standing here, 11,600 years later, trying to reconstruct their reasons from carved limestone and scattered bone. They were not building a message for the future. They were building something for themselves, for their own immediate community, their own specific gods or ancestors or shared convictions, never intending it as a riddle for distant descendants to solve. That we are still here, still asking, still patiently sifting through what they left behind, is itself a kind of accident, the unintended consequence of a burial meant to close a chapter rather than open one for strangers 10,000 years removed. And yet here we are, standing where they stood, looking at what they made, asking the same kind of questions any thoughtful visitor to any ancient sacred place eventually asks. What did this mean to you? Why did this matter enough to build? What were you hoping would last when you covered it over and walked away? The hill cannot answer in words. It answers instead in the only language available to it, the patient, weathered language of carved stone, still standing, still facing inward, still waiting 11,600 years later, for whoever comes next to stand quietly enough and look closely enough to understand at least a little of what it is trying to say. What the stone does say, clearly enough that no reasonable researcher disputes it, is this. Long before anyone in this corner of the world had planted a field, built a permanent house, or written a single word, a community of hunter-gatherers looked at a bare hilltop above a river plain and decided it deserved something more than passing through. They built it a circle of standing stones. They carved into those stones the animals that mattered most to them, the foxes and boars and cranes and vultures of a landscape that has since changed beyond recognition. They gathered there, again and again, across generations, for reasons that mattered enough to repeat. And when it was finished, whatever finished meant to them, they buried it with their own hands, trusting the ground to keep it safe until someone, eventually, came looking. Someone did. It only took 10,000 years. That is, in the end, the entire shape of this story. A patient hill, a patient burial, and a patience among the living, eventually, to match it. The hill is still there tonight, under the same wide Anatolian sky, holding the rest of its story in the ground it has not yet given up, waiting, as it always has, without any particular hurry. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.